Okay, so let's dive right in. When you look at history, especially the history of these huge, sprawling, diverse civilizations, you're always sort of searching for the secret sauce, right?
The key to longevity.
Exactly. We're looking for these models of unity, and we're hoping to find lessons on how a really complex society can manage difference. I mean, cultural, religious, even legal difference without just completely falling apart.
And if you listen to a lot of modern political thinking, the answer is almost always presented as, well, unity through conformity.
Right. One standard.
One law, one identity. Everyone has to sort of get on the same
Yeah,
page.
right.
But what if the historical record, what if the sources we're looking at today tell us that the most successful, the most resilient societies actually did the complete opposite?
Stability through diversity.
Stability through the institutionalization of diversity.
Yeah.
It's a huge shift in thinking.
And that is exactly the, I think, extraordinary legal journey we are taking you on today. You came to us curious about how complex states manage difference. And our mission for this deep dive is to trace this really profound shared legal idea across, 1,000 years?
At least. We're connecting three very distinct civilizations. You have medieval al-Andalus, then the massive Ottoman Empire, and then, and this is the surprising part, modern Pakistan.
And the goal is to uncover the mechanisms that allowed all these different faiths and communities to coexist and, frankly, to really thrive under a single state.
Yeah, and our deep dive today, it draws very heavily on some really insightful research by Mr. Zaheer Ahmad Meer. His work focuses on comparative judicial history. It's almost like legal archaeology.
I like that.
He demonstrates this unbroken line of thought that, links the legal structures of 10th century Muslim Spain directly to the Ottoman Millet system hundreds of years later.
Yeah.
And then shows how those exact same principles pop up again in a landmark 2014 Supreme Court ruling in Pakistan.
It's just incredible to think a legal concept could be that durable, that it could last that long. And this gets to the core paradox we really have to wrestle with today.
Which is?
Well, moderns were so attached to the idea of the unified nation state. One nation, one monolithic law applied equally to everyone.
Sure, that's the default model.
But these historical models, they suggest that the most stable societies actually chose institutionalized pluralism. They didn't just tolerate difference, that's not the right word. They wrote it into their legal code.
And what's so fascinating here, what the sources really hammer home, is that these structures weren't just passive. They weren't just sort of shrugging their shoulders at minorities and saying, oh, fine, do what you want.
No.
They were legally, and you could argue, constitutionally designed for diversity. So we're tracing this unbroken line of judicial thought across centuries, and it proves that this principle, that diversity is an asset, not a liability, is profoundly adaptable no matter what the political climate is.
And the idea that strength comes from explicitly letting communities keep their own laws, I mean, that is just so counterintuitive to how most modern states operate today, where the goal is often, homogenization.
It is.
And yet, as we're about to see, history argues again and again that this institutionalized difference, far from being a source of chaos, was actually the foundation, the very bedrock of stability for some of the world's longest-lasting and most vibrant empires. So let's start at the beginning with what the sources are calling Europe's first legal renaissance. When we talk about legal revolutions, our minds often jump to, the Romans and their codes, or maybe we skip ahead to the Enlightenment thinkers in the 18th century.
Usual suspects.
Yeah, exactly. But the sources we have today, they establish al-Andalus, that's Muslim Spain, as a civilization that created a legal infrastructure that was, and this is not an exaggeration, centuries ahead of its time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This wasn't just a place known for its amazing poetry and science and architecture, though it had all of that. It was a deeply sophisticated system that just fundamentally changed how law interacted with faith and community in medieval Europe.
Okay, so let's break that down. The period we're talking about, it spans from roughly the 8th to the 15th century.
A long time. A very long time. And the core achievement of al-Andalus was its political and judicial infrastructure.
Yeah.
I mean, the fundamental structure was genuinely revolutionary for its time in Europe. Instead of imposing one blanket law on everyone.
Which would have been the standard approach.
Right.
Wow.
Instead, you had Muslims, Christians, and Jews all living under the same political authority of the caliphate. But, and this is the crucial part, they retained their own legal autonomy.
In this distinction, I think this is probably the single most important takeaway from our entire deep dive today. It's the difference between passive tolerance and active pluralism. The critique pointed out that we have to stop just saying there's a difference and actually explain what it means in terms of government action.
Yeah.
So what did al-Andalus actually do that made it Structured, institutionalized, constitutional pluralism. What does that look like on the ground?
Well, tolerance, the word itself, it implies that the majority is simply, permitting the existence of the minority. Maybe they're second-class citizens, but fundamentally they're just being left alone.
It's a passive act. We tolerate you.
Exactly. Institutional pluralism, on the other hand, means the state is actively dedicating legal, administrative, and even financial resources to protect and sustain the internal legal traditions of all its communities.
So it's about state commitment. It's an active role. What was the state actually doing? What were the specific actions?
They were doing three key things, really. First was formal recognition. The caliphate didn't just ignore the non-Muslim communities. It formally recognized the positions of Christian bishops and Jewish rabbis as legitimate legal officers within the state. They were part of the system.
So they had official standing.
Official standing. Second, they set up jurisdictional boundaries. The state formally defined the areas where communal law applied. So we're talking mainly about personal status, marriage, inheritance, internal disputes. And it guaranteed that its own Sharia courts would not interfere in those specific areas.
That's a huge guarantee.
It is. And third, there was administrative support. The state often provided physical spaces like courthouses, protection for judges, and sometimes even financial stipends for these non-Muslim courts to operate. So the state didn't just allow difference, it was actively guaranteeing and even funding its continuity.
Wow.
And that made legal pluralism the operational norm. It was just baked into the state's very foundation.
That makes the difference crystal clear. It wasn't some temporary measure or a favor. It was the architecture of the state itself.
Precisely. And this commitment to institutional pluralism led directly to what the sources call the multi-court ecosystem. If you can, just try to imagine the judicial landscape of, say, 10th century Cordoba. It was a true federation of legal systems, all operating under a single political umbrella.
A complexity that was just unmatched anywhere else in Europe for centuries.
For centuries.
Okay, this is why I start getting into the logistics of it all. Because it sounds great in theory, but how did it work? You had the standard Sharia courts for Muslims, run by the qadis. Okay, that makes sense. But then running parallel to that, you had canon law courts for Christians.
Right, presided over by their own appointed bishops or judges.
And then rabbinical courts for Jews, led by their dayanim. I mean, logistically, wouldn't having three separate, powerful legal systems create massive conflict, or what lawyers today call forum shopping, where people try to game the system by picking the court that's most favorable to them?
A great question. And that's where the genius of the system's design really comes in.
How did they solve that?
Jurisdiction was very clearly delineated. It was primarily based on the identities of the people involved and the nature of the dispute. So if a dispute was purely internal, let's say a marriage contract, a divorce, an inheritance disagreement between two Christians, it fell solely and completely under the canon courts.
And the state was hands-off.
Totally hands-off. The caliphate would simply enforce the judgment if it was necessary, but it wouldn't intervene in the legal reasoning. However, the system also recognized that not all disputes are purely communal.
Right, because al-Andalus was a massive economic powerhouse. Commerce must have been happening between everyone.
Exactly. And that's why the system needed courts that could transcend religious identity. This shows just incredible pragmatic foresight. They established dedicated commercial courts.
Okay, tell me more about those.
So if a Jewish merchant from Seville was in a trade dispute with a Muslim farmer from the countryside over, say, a shipment of grain, neither the rabbinical court nor the Sharia court was the right place for that.
Of course not. They'd each be biased.
So they went to the commercial court, which applied a sort of shared, you could call it secularized, body of commercial law that was focused purely on contracts, weights and measures, trade customs.
Practical stuff.
All practical stuff.
Yep.
And this ensured that the economy had a swift, reliable, and most importantly, religiously neutral framework to operate in.
I love that detail. I mean, that single example just demonstrates functionality over ideology. It means they weren't just thinking about religious identity. They were focused on making sure the economy worked for everyone.
And that wasn't all. On top of that, you had the administrative courts. These dealt with matters of the state, public order, major criminal cases like murder or treason, big governance issues.
And those were under the Sultan's direct authority.
Correct. And, maybe most critically, they had a formal appeals mechanism that was managed through regional qadis. This provided oversight and some consistency. So if a Christian felt their communal court was being unjust,
They had somewhere to go.
they could appeal to the highest state authority, not, and this is key, not to overturn their communal law, but to ensure that fairness was being applied within the rules of that institutional guarantee.
It sounds like being a judge in 10th century Cordoba required a staggering amount of knowledge, not just of Sharia, but the ability to understand the structure of two other major legal codes and how they all fit together.
It was incredibly sophisticated. And this multi-legal structure, it wasn't just diverse for the sake of being diverse. It was highly functional. And according to the sources, it was the very engine of its stability.
Okay, so let's put a pin in a specific moment in time. The sources point to one ruler in particular as the one who really perfected this system.
Yes. To really understand the political economy of this system, we have to look at the reign of Abd al-Rahman III from 912 to 961. This was, by all accounts, the golden peak of al-Andalus.
And his success wasn't just military might.
Not at all. It was rooted in formalizing and strengthening this very system of legal pluralism we're talking about. He wasn't just a powerful ruler, he was an institutional builder. He understood that stable domestic institutions are what underpin real imperial power.
So what specific steps did he take? What did he do to solidify the system?
Well, his actions basically codified what had, up to that point, often been custom. He formalized the legal autonomy of religious minorities, which gave the non-Muslim communities a guaranteed legal and political status they could count on.
So it wasn't just a handshake deal anymore, it was law.
It was hard law. He provided explicit protection of life and property for non-Muslims, making it a state crime to violate their rights. This wasn't soft tolerance. This was the central authority saying, we will enforce this.
And that protection, that provides the security and the confidence that people need to invest, to build, to innovate.
Exactly. And look at his political innovations, which are just as fascinating. He instituted things like joint commercial arbitration. And get this, mixed legal councils for urban governance.
What does that mean, a mixed council?
It means when complex citywide issues came up, say, water rights for a river that ran through the city or market regulations or public works that affected everyone, they didn't just rely on a purely Muslim administrative body to decide.
That would be the easy way out.
The easy way, but not the stable way. They created forums where representatives, the Muslim Qadi, the Christian bishop, the Jewish Nagid, all sat together to work it out. This forced co-governance and collaboration at the highest levels of city life.
So non-Muslim leaders weren't just figureheads for their own internal affairs. They were active, empowered partners in the civic life of the state.
Absolutely. Christian bishops and Jewish rabbis could actively adjudicate disputes in their communities, they could enforce their own laws, and maintain their traditions. But the key structural feature is that they did all of this under the explicit protection of the state.
That's the guarantee again.
That's the guarantee. And it transformed them from being merely tolerated groups into essential, respected organs of the state's judicial infrastructure. The state, in essence, it decentralized personal law, which secured local buy-in and loyalty while it maintained centralized control over security and final oversight through the caliphate.
The genius of it is really in the simplicity of the underlying philosophy. If we were to boil down the entire legal philosophy of al-Andalus to one core principle, it seems to center on how they treated the non-Muslim communities, who are known as al-Udima.
The protected communities.
Right, the protected communities.
And the core legal principle, it was simple, but incredibly effective. It was basically the mandate for the entire state, and went like this. Al-Udima are guaranteed justice under their own laws, with the state as the guarantor of fairness.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that concept of the state as the neutral guarantor, as the safety net, that was absolutely crucial, wasn't it?
It was everything. It meant that this legal pluralism wasn't anarchic. It wasn't a free-for-all.
Right.
If there was, say, an internal power struggle in the Jewish community, or if a Christian felt their own canon court was becoming tyrannical, they had an avenue of appeal to the callous court. The state wasn't there to dictate their private laws, but it was there to ensure that the process was fair, that it was impartial, and that it upheld the foundational rights guaranteed by the caliphate to all its subjects.
And that guarantee, that provided the structural integrity the whole system needed. It allowed the individual legal systems to thrive without collapsing into chaos or persecution or, localized tyranny.
Exactly. And this sophistication, this rational legal reasoning, the public documentation, advanced property rights that protected everyone, this unparalleled religious pluralism. This is why the sources give it the title, Europe's first legal renaissance.
It's not just a fancy phrase. It's a statement about the depth of their institutional design.
Okay, so the Andalusian model is brilliant, but As we've seen on other deep dives, historical successes can often be isolated. They can be one-offs.
Right, a product of a specific time and place.
But the power of this research, I think, lies in showing that this legal idea, this concept of institutionalized pluralism, it was not isolated. It was portable.
Yeah.
It could transcend the specific context of the Iberian Peninsula.
And that's the critical historical continuity we need to trace. Centuries later, long after al-Andalus had crumbled, the Ottoman Empire picked up and expanded the core Andalusian idea.
Which is really compelling evidence that the principle works, right? The state actually commits to it. It shows you can transfer successful governance mechanisms across time and space. You can. And the Ottoman version of this was the famous Millet system. The term Millet just refers to a recognized religious or ethnic community.
And the Ottomans, their empire was massive. It stretched from Southeast Europe all the way through North Africa and the Middle East. They desperately needed a way to govern millions of people, speaking dozens of languages and practicing so many different faiths.
The sheer scale of it demanded decentralization. It was a practical necessity. So the Ottoman system formally recognized multiple groups, the Greek Orthodox Christians, who were the largest group, but also Armenians, Jews, various Catholic communities.
And the scope of autonomy they were granted under this Millet system, it was incredibly broad, right? It touched on almost every aspect of their communal life.
It was far beyond what most modern decentralized states would even consider allowing.
So let's make this real. If I was a Jewish citizen living in Salonika, or maybe a Greek Orthodox person in Constantinople, what did this legal autonomy actually mean for my daily life?
It meant institutional self-governance. These communities had the right to run their own religious courts, to apply their own laws, to manage their own schools and hospitals, to appoint their own religious leadership, like the ecumenical patriarch for the Orthodox or the chief rabbi for the Jews.
Wow.
And crucially, they could settle all of their internal family, personal status, and inheritance disputes entirely within their own communal system.
So the state would enforce the rulings, but the law being applied was the community's own. That sounds like a radical form of federalism, but based on religion instead of geography.
That's a perfect way to put it. If you were an Orthodox Christian in the Ottoman Empire, your marriage, your divorce, the inheritance of your property, all of that was adjudicated by an Orthodox court according to Orthodox canon law.
Okay, but we have to introduce the complexity here, as the critique reminded us. This sounds amazing, but while the Millet system granted this massive autonomy, it was also part of an imperial structure that clearly recognized the Muslim community as the political majority.
That's a crucial point. We can't just praise the autonomy without acknowledging the inherent friction in the system.
So, for example, wasn't the Millet system also used to justify things like differential taxation or social restrictions on non-Muslims?
It was. The Millet system operated alongside the jizya, which was a poll tax for non-Muslims. And historically, yes, non-Muslims did have certain restrictions on holding the absolute highest political or military offices.
So it wasn't a system of perfect equality in our modern sense of the word?
Not at all. The sources are very clear on this. It was a system of institutionalized difference that guaranteed judicial and cultural autonomy, but it came at the cost of full political parity.
So why did it last for so long?
It endured because for 600 years, that guaranteed protection of communal identity and legal tradition was, for most people, a stabilizing factor that far outweighed the political and financial disadvantages. It secured social order, and for the most part, it secured their loyalty to the empire.
This complexity is what makes it so fascinating, because it proves the concept is robust. Despite the huge political differences between a caliphate in Spain and this massive multi-continental empire, the core legal mechanisms, they seem to stay structurally identical.
The parallels are just stark. It really shows a conscious continuation of a successful legal philosophy.
Yeah.
I mean, let's just compare the systems structurally side by side.
Okay, let's do it. On law focus, both systems granted autonomy primarily in family law and matters of faith and personal status.
Right, and that's a sphere where identity is most fiercely held. By securing that sphere, both states effectively neutralized a huge potential source of religious dissent.
Then you look at the communities. Al-Andalus dealt with, what, 3 major formalized legal communities?
Primarily, yes. But the Ottoman system, it scaled this up dramatically. It recognized and managed multiple distinct communities across a massive geographic area. This proves that the pluralistic structure is scalable. It's adaptable to mass diversity.
And the state role, that remained so consistently defined across the centuries. In both Muslim Spain and the Ottoman Empire, the central state was the guarantor. It ensured protection and fairness, and it acted as the ultimate centralized oversight authority.
It prevented one community from politically or violently subsuming another. It kept the peace.
And finally, the structural setup itself. Multi-religious courts coexisted, whether that was under Sharia rule in al-Andalus or imperial law in the Ottoman Empire. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a proven mechanism for governance.
It allowed difference to operate productively within a single political framework.
So the core lesson here, tying back to the critique, is that both of these civilizations understood a really profound concept. Unity is strengthened by respecting diversity.
Exactly. They didn't try to erase difference, they institutionalized it. They made it part of their operating manual for long-term stability.
And this continuity, it demonstrates that the success of this model wasn't dependent on a specific ruling family or a specific geography.
No, it depended on the enduring political and judicial principle of institutional protection for minority laws and identities. The longevity of the Ottoman Empire, 6 centuries, that stands as historical proof that this model of leveraging diversity as an asset of the state actually works on a macro scale.
And now we take this enormous leap forward in time. We're changing the entire political framework from caliphates and empires to a contemporary democratic constitutional republic. We're going to Pakistan.
It's a dramatic jump, for sure.
Yeah.
But the research argues, very persuasively, I think, that the ancient genius of legal pluralism resurfaced at a really critical moment in the 21st century.
And this is such a profound illustration of how these historical principles can be translated, how they can be applied within a modern constitutional democracy that's committed to universal human rights and equality.
Right. The historical need for institutional safeguards, it remains, regardless of the political packaging it comes in.
So we're focusing on a specific case. The 2014 Supreme Court judgment in Pakistan on minority rights. It was authored by Justice Tassaduq Jillani.
And this ruling, it's not just celebrated in Pakistan, it's recognized internationally as a really significant milestone in modern constitutional history. It wasn't just a reaction to one small case, it was a comprehensive rearticulation of the state's fundamental responsibility towards its non-Muslim citizens.
To understand why this ruling was so necessary, though, we do have to address the critique and talk about the context. What was happening in Pakistan at the time?
Well, in the years just before this ruling, Pakistan had seen some horrific incidents of sectarian violence and, frankly, institutional neglect of its minority communities. There were specific attacks on churches, on temples, on members of minority communities that really highlighted a failure of the legislative and executive branches to adequately protect these vulnerable groups.
So this wasn't just a philosophical statement from the court.
Not at all. It was a necessary institutional fix. It was aimed at stemming a real tide of violence and discrimination that was threatening the fabric of the country.
So the court effectively stepped in to impose an institutional safeguard where the other branches of government had failed.
Exactly. It shifted the framework from this passive, often ineffective idea of protection to active, court-mandated state responsibility.
So what did the ruling actually mandate? What did it force the government to do?
Well, first, the ruling affirmed the core democratic principle of equal citizenship for all religious minorities. That's the modern baseline you have to start with. But then it went further and implemented tangible institutional safeguards, much like Abd al-Rahman did 1,000 years before.
For example, it mandated the protection of places of worship. So churches, temples, gurdwaras. It wasn't just about their security. It was mandating their specific upkeep and restoration where they had been damaged.
And critically, it demanded the creation of a dedicated Minority Rights Commission. This is the 21st century democratic equivalent of the Sultan acting as the guarantor of fairness. It's the ultimate safety net.
So it's a permanent, legally empowered oversight body.
A permanent body specifically tasked with monitoring minority welfare, investigating their complaints, and ensuring their rights aren't just trampled by political expediency or the power of the majority.
The judgment also went after the systemic roots of prejudice, didn't it? It called for curriculum reform to prevent hate speech and discrimination in school textbooks.
Which is a monumental effort.
Yeah.
It's addressing prejudice at the source. And finally, it insisted on strict, visible action against discrimination and violence, making sure the state's entire security apparatus is fully mobilized to protect vulnerable groups. No exceptions.
This comprehensive, multifaceted approach, it spans security, education, policy, legal oversight. It's highly significant. It shows a modern judiciary applying checks on the system to make sure that the commitment to pluralism isn't just rhetoric.
It has to be institutionalized through concrete policy changes and dedicated bodies.
And the court's foundational declaration in 2014, it really echoes that ancient principle of institutionalized protection, but it grounds it in a modern democratic context.
The declaration was absolutely clear. It said, "Tolerance and religious freedom are the foundation of a democratic society."
And the strength of this ruling, I think, lies in the diverse legal authorities the court decided to invoke. They were very strategic. They consciously built their argument on multiple foundations, weaving together different legal traditions to give it maximum legitimacy and resilience.
Absolutely. They drew directly on Quranic principles of justice and the protection of the vulnerable, which grounded the decision in the spiritual heritage of the majority population.
Which is politically very smart. It helps ensure the ruling has popular acceptance.
Of course. But at the same time, it invoked Pakistan's own constitutional equality clauses, which grounded it firmly in the secular democratic structure of the state. And finally, it cited international law obligations and global human rights standards, which aligned the state's commitment with the broader international community.
This careful layering of religious, national, and international legal authority, it just shows the court's intent to make the protection of minorities an unassailable, non-negotiable principle. It's very similar to the legal sophistication we saw in al-Andalus.
It's an intellectual exercise in finding a universal consensus around the necessity of protecting the vulnerable.
So if we place the 10th century model right next to this 21st century ruling, the philosophical resemblance is just compelling, even though the political mechanics are completely different.
The parallels are there. In al-Andalus, you had multi-faith legal protection that was embodied by separate, state-protected religious courts for each community.
And in Pakistan in 2014, you have constitutional protection of minorities that's backed up by these special dedicated oversight bodies like the Rights Commission. The goal institutionalizing legal protection is identical.
And where al-Andalus viewed pluralism as a strength that was necessary for imperial and economic stability.
Pakistan's 2014 judgment explicitly enshrines diversity as a constitutional value that is necessary for democratic health and social cohesion. Both systems are recognizing that difference is an asset, not a threat.
And the most enduring constant, the thread that runs through it all, is the shared responsibility of the state. In al-Andalus, the state was the guarantor of communal fairness and security. In Pakistan 2014, the state is explicitly responsible for proactive safety, equality, and creating systems to prevent discrimination.
The core duty of the sovereign to protect all its citizens remains unchanged. It doesn't matter if that sovereign is a caliph or a Supreme Court.
And what's so fascinating here is how this judgment acts as Pakistan's modern step toward institutional pluralism. It's consciously echoing that ancient Andalusian tradition of justice, but it's applying that thousand-year-old successful principle within a modern democratic framework.
It proves that the success of legal pluralism isn't contingent on the political system.
No, it's contingent on the will of the state, or in this case, the judiciary, to guarantee justice for everyone.
This has just been an extraordinary mapping exercise, tracing this single profound legal idea across a millennium, 3 continents, and these vastly different political structures. So now we have to synthesize all this data and pull out the ultimate so what for the listener.
Right. What does this grand sweep of judicial history ultimately teach us about effective governance?
We have to look at the mechanism of protection across all 3 systems, side by side, to see the remarkable consistency in their approach to governing difference.
So let's start with al-Andalus. The defining mechanism there was coexistence. You had multi-faith courts coexisting under a centralized caliphate, and it was all underpinned by strong executive protection that formalized everyone's jurisdiction.
Then you jump to the Ottoman Millet system. The mechanism there was autonomy at scale. Vast legal autonomy for recognized religious groups, underpinned by institutional protection of their diversity, which was absolutely essential for managing millions of people across hundreds of different regions.
And then you arrive at Pakistan in 2014. Here, the mechanism is constitutional safeguard. It's a judicial intervention that mandates deep, proactive constitutional safeguards for minorities, and it's underpinned by judicial protection against neglect from the other branches of government or tyranny from the majority.
The consistency is just undeniable. I mean, despite the huge differences in execution, whether it's executive, institutional, or judicial.
The shared result is clear. Legal pluralism strengthened unity. It ensured that cultural and legal diversity could flourish under one governing framework without descending into fragmentation. The state achieved unity not by demanding homogeneity,
but by structurally accommodating heterogeneity.
That's the key.
So the sources, they're driving toward a single unified conclusion based on these 3 models. The unbroken message across 1,000 years is that the most successful and resilient states in history are those that guarantee justice to every community, not just the majority.
And this really moves beyond simple rhetoric. I mean, most states will say they aim for equality, but equality in a majority rule system can still lead to vulnerability if the majority's culture dictates all the rules.
Give me an example of that.
Well, think about this. If a majority-run state establishes, say, Sunday as the national day of rest, that is equal for all citizens on paper. But it inherently disadvantages observant Jews or Muslims whose holy days are Saturday and Friday.
Right. It's a subtle form of exclusion.
Exactly. The key, as these historical models demonstrate, is moving beyond simple equality to an institutional guarantee.
Which brings us to what the sources call the ratio decidendi, the decisive legal principle that we can derive from all this comparative research. This is the ultimate mandate for a just and stable state.
And that principle is justice must protect every citizen, and minorities must receive not only equality but special safeguards to ensure fairness.
That is a powerful distinction. It elevates the whole concept from simple state permission to active state responsibility.
It's not enough for the law to be theoretically applied the same way to everyone. Given the inherent power imbalance between a massive majority and a small minority, the state has to deliberately impose special institutional safeguards.
Whether that's the Sultan's Appeal Court, the Millet's autonomy, or a modern minority rights commission.
Exactly. All of those things are designed to ensure fairness and prevent the majority's power from eroding the minority's fundamental rights or their communal identity.
So in essence, what the historical record is telling us is that justice isn't blind to power dynamics. A truly just state has to deliberately counterbalance those dynamics through specific legal institutions.
It has to actively intervene to protect the ability of diverse communities to remain diverse and to feel secure.
And we can summarize the effectiveness of this pluralistic model just by looking briefly at the long-term historical impact. It really reinforces the thesis that this legal genius paid massive dividends in stability and cultural flourishing.
It did. Let's just listen.
Al-Andalus became a global center of civilization. It flourished intellectually and economically. It attracted scholars and trade from all over the known world. And this was due, in large part, to the domestic stability provided by its multi-faith legal system.
Which allowed commerce and learning to cross communal lines without friction.
Then you have the Ottomans. They ruled a vast, multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire for 600 years, an incredible feat of longevity. And they did it by successfully using the Millet system to manage difference across huge geographies.
They converted heterogeneity into administrative resilience.
And finally, Pakistan's 2014 judgment. It became a constitutional milestone that strengthened its democratic ideals, and it provided a strong legal foundation for future political reforms, setting a new, higher standard for the active protection of vulnerable communities.
So the ultimate moral lesson from all these examples, it's profound and it's historically repeatable. Pluralism is not a threat. It is the foundation of a just state.
A society that protects only its majority is inherently unjust, and it's prone to internal instability and eventually decline.
But a society that actively protects all its people, that guarantees the rights and laws of every single community through institutional safeguards, that society becomes resilient, it becomes prosperous, and it becomes, you could say, immortal in history, because its principles transcend localized prejudice.
This journey has been, well, it's been incredible. From the sophistication of 10th century Cordoba and the expansive reach of the Ottoman Empire, all the way to the modern constitutional challenge met by 21st century Islamabad.
It provides a clear, consistent, and historically verified answer to how multi-religious states achieve longevity and prosperity.
Through actively institutionalizing the right to difference, it's just a powerful and, I think, very persuasive argument for the enduring brilliance of legal pluralism.
Absolutely. The research makes a compelling case that legal systems that consciously protect and incorporate diverse identities are simply more resilient and more successful over the long term, which, it raises an important question for us to consider about contemporary governance.
Especially in states that are currently experiencing pressure to consolidate power and dismantle these kinds of protections.
Exactly. What happens when a modern state tries to reverse or systematically dismantle historical or constitutional protections for minorities, all for the sake of a perceived monolithic national identity?
History suggests that process rarely delivers the stability it promises. The lesson, etched into the successive empires that lasted for centuries, is that long-term political stability comes not from enforced homogeneity.
But from the detailed, complex, sometimes messy legal mechanisms that actively manage the inevitable heterogeneity of any large society.
So if judicial structures that guarantee legal autonomy and special institutional safeguards to minorities led to centuries of stability, peace, and even a legal renaissance in the past.
What does that imply about the long-term stability of contemporary nation-states, many of which are less than 100 years old, that insist on a single monolithic legal identity for all citizens, ignoring the specific needs of their vulnerable populations?
And that is the ultimate thought we want to leave you with today. What lessons from 10th century Cordoba might your own legal system, wherever you happen to be listening from, still need to learn in securing justice, not just for the majority, but for every single community within its borders?